Wow. Episode 5 of Alone Season 9 is kind of blowing me away. There's so much to talk about, but I just want to start by saying this might be my favorite season of Alone ever. I love these people. I love the things they're talking about. I love how successful they are at bringing in food. And I love the editing of this season and how they're really showing some of the depth of the Alone experience and letting the real philosophies of the people come through. So I'm very excited to review episode 5. And in part 1, we're going to be talking, I believe there's a mosquito right in my forehead. Yes, there is. In part 1, we're going to be talking more about shelters. We're going to be talking about hunting ethics. We're going to be talking about fire and ways to manage it, about water and how one chooses to treat or not treat it. And we're going to be talking a little bit about gut parasites. Let's dive in. So the episode starts at Benji's camp, and I love this part. And if you've been watching my reviews, I bet you know why. Benji basically says all of the things about his shelter that I said about it the last time we talked about it, right? It's way too big. It's just not practical for that environment when it gets really cold and with the weather and wind they have there. It's going to be too hard to really warm it and shut the weather out. So I love that Benji is coming around and recognizing that even though he put some effort into setting up that shelter, it is really not worth continuing to move forward with it because it's just not going to be practical. I wish that more folks on this season were able to shift gears once they realize that they're putting in way too much time and effort, or when they realize that the shelter that they had thought was going to work really isn't a good call for that place. So kudos, Benji, for recognizing that early on and doing something about it. Love it. I also noticed that as he was talking about moving shelter, he didn't say I, he said we, touching back in with what I talked about on the review of episode 4, where we see people starting to use we all the time once we get to the 2 or 3 week mark. Super fascinating little insight into what the alone experience does to our brains and our language. He also talks about the bear that came to his gut pile, and he says the same thing that I said from episode 1 when Jessie didn't go over that bear that came to her right away. I said, you know, it's pretty early in the season and pretty warm to be processing an entire bear. And Benji said exactly that, and he knows it. He knows that it would be a ton of work. It would be the only thing he could be doing, and that he would still be liable to lose some of that bear meat. So again, really good forward thinking and seeing, you know what? This plan that I thought I had that was going to be the best thing, it's not actually time for that yet. So again, super kudos to Benji, really good modeling. I'm not totally down with the shelter design that he goes with, the wiki up, for a bunch of different reasons. We can see that it's not a great shelter design for a rectangular tarp, right? That tarp is really awkward on it. It's going to be really hard to waterproof all of those areas. Now, if he was somewhere where there were big trees and there was a lot of bark that he could peel and use to shingle to make it waterproof, or if there were large leaves or cattails or enough grass for thatching, something like that, then it could be a good design. But given the circumstances he's in and what he has to work with, I don't think the wiki up is really the way to go. Also, the thing with wiki ups is they're designed to have the smoke go out the top, but what that means is that all heat rises, right? So all of your heat is going right out the smoke hole. So it's not as efficient as something that's going to allow some kind of chimney or wood stove situation. It's actually going to keep your heat in. So much better than the shelter that he started out with. I would have gone with a different design that made better use of the materials at hand and that tarp that he has. Hey everyone, I want to remind you to please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and go ahead and hit the notifications bell if you want to hear when my videos come out. Also, really encourage you to consider joining my Patreon membership, and you will get to talk to some of the participants of Alone Season 9 through that. And then, of course, we go to Jessie, and I think it's interesting that they put those back to back, because here we see Benji with this huge shelter saying, you know what, this isn't really practical. And then we see Jessie, about which the same thing is true. And she says it right in there. This is way more time and way more energy than I pictured it taking. But she's so invested in it now that she doesn't shift courses like Benji did, which I understand because she's already obviously poured so much time and energy in it, and it's so close. So she doesn't want to give up all of that effort and all of those calories she burned. I get it. At the same time, I think she would be much better off if she lowered that front wall, cut the shelter in half, and just went with shoring up that area, because that thing is just monstrous and it's going to be a bear to heat. Huh. In fact, it will take a bear to heat it. If she gets a bear, she's going to be golden. But short of a bear, the calories her body is going to be using to heat that thing, because it's going to be really hard to heat with a fire, are going to be significant. That said, oh my gosh, right? It's clearly beautifully built. I mean, you can really see that strong building skills she has, that beautiful ladder she has up in front, all of the lashings, it's well thought out. That looks like a cabin that you would want to stay in for 9 months plus, right? It looks like a house, not just a shelter to be in for temporary and to live through a harsh winter in with minimal calories. Love her name for it, Hodgepodge Lodge, super creative. I think it's really a good idea to name your shelters. I personally, on season 6, I tried to stop calling a shelter and call it a cabin. I named it Spruce Grouse Cottage, and I put the wings and the feet from my spruce grouse up to decorate it, because that's what makes it feel like a home. And when you have a home, it means that you are there to stay. The idea of using the word shelter kind of implies that it's temporary, and that's not a great mindset if your goal is to stay there as long as possible and be the last one out. So Hodgepodge Lodge, awesome, love it, Jessie, very clever, awesome bed, really hoping that it works out for you, and I'm worried about it. I hear you when you say this has taken so much more time and energy than I thought it would. Which brings us to another important point, which is that time goes differently on Alone. What we have in mind that we can accomplish in a day is really different when you're in challenging circumstances, when you're underfed and likely dehydrated, and when you don't have the tools and the resources that you're used to having. So you really got to think about being wise with what you've got and not thinking about things the way you would in the rest of your life when you are just not going to be operating at full capacity out there. It's so different. And I see this over and over, it blowing people away, how different it is and how different time scales are. So let this be a lesson to those of you who are thinking about something like Alone. Learn from what you're seeing of these folks and shift your mind way ahead of time. I love that Jessie follows up by saying, but you know what? This is part of my spirit path. I'm building this because it matters to me. So you can see that it's not just really wonderful skills, but kind of poor decision making. She's aware of it being more than she thought she was biting off, but she says, it's okay because this feels important to me and I want to put my energy to that. So given that, you know, everybody has different goals out there. So good for you, Jessie, for being clear about why you're sticking with this and that it matters to you, and demonstrating that there are things more important than the competition and the win. And for you, maybe it's making an absolutely amazing shelter out there that you could live in for years and years. Adam, wow, what an archer, right? I mean, we are talking about a target that is smaller than a dime, right through the eyes of that squirrel and then right through the back of the squirrel's skull. Instant, really humane kill. Doesn't mess up any of the organs, does mess up the brain, and the brain is the richest source of fat and therefore calories on a whole squirrel. So in that way, it's kind of a bummer to have the brain likely destroyed, but still, seriously, amazing shot. So good that he's like, you know what? I can hear another squirrel, but I'm gonna let it go. And I think it's smart to do that because you want to keep the population of squirrels right around your shelter high. What you don't want to do is take out all of the food in your immediate environment when you still have the calories in your system to range further. And then once it gets to later in your time, when you're likely a lot weaker, have a lot less energy, have no resources close around you. So smart to be showing some reserve around not hunting all of the things right in your area, to say nothing of course, the population impacts. But squirrels are rodents and they reproduce really fast. So I don't think he's going to actually have damage to the population long term, but certainly for his time out, it would make a difference. I love seeing, again, something that I have wanted to point out on other episodes, but there was just too much to talk about, that satchel that Adam has hanging from his belt, right? It is the liner of one of his boots. So you get to take 2 pairs of boots on Alone, one that's a waterproof pair, usually for warmer times, and then another that's going to be really, really warm for once you're there long enough that it's getting way below freezing. So it seems to me that he's using the liner from the boots that he has for that as a bag to carry stuff around. And I think that this is brilliant on its own, but also demonstrates a really important principle on Alone, which is when you have only 10 items, you want to get the most use you can out of all of those, but also out of your clothing items. So there's less limitations on your clothing items than there are on your gear items. So it's really wise to be very, very creative and ingenuitive with different ways you can do those. We saw that with Juan Pablo using his gaiters. I think it's important to have some item that you sacrifice for another use, because it's just going to really broaden the range of things that are possible to you. Thinking out of the box is absolutely key out there. Oh my gosh, I love his little, "Hi, may I help you, ma'am?" at the counter. That was absolutely hilarious and perfect. That's exactly what that window looks like it's for. And man, pretty awesome for him to have that many buffet options, right? He's also holding up some berries, which by looking at them, I think they're rowan berries, mountain ash, which I have to say, they're not delicious. They also might have been high bush cranberries. It's a little bit hard to see. Their stems are really red, but I believe those were rowan berries, which can be pretty darn hard on the belly. I have eaten them and definitely got, one, you have to cook them, and two, even cooked, I've definitely gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, any more of those would really hurt my belly. So I'm a little curious if potentially those rowan berries were part of what was going on in his guts later. He seems to think not, but you know, lots of different things that we are throwing at our systems out there. So it's really hard to know what it is that your body's reacting to. We then go to Juan Pablo and we see him talking about the water, and water and parasites are definitely a focal point of this particular episode. So I want to talk a little bit about it. One thing just to point out, he's got the same pot that I brought on Alone season 6. So it's really fun for me to watch that, and looks like it's working well for him. So Juan Pablo talks about drinking water right from the river as a really good strategy for him. And on the same episode, we see people really, really struggling with parasites, and we're not sure where they got them from. So I feel like this is a very important point. Not all systems are the same. So what is safe for one person might be really, really problematic for another person. And Juan Pablo makes a wonderful point. He says, look, I am from Mexico, so I have a particularly strong stomach. Plus, I've been drinking wild water for 10 years. So he has, one, started out with a more resilient system because of what it was exposed to in his younger life. And then two, made an active point of exposing his system to wild water throughout his adult life, which means that he's probably already got some resistance to some of those things. Now, there are some parasites that you're not going to get resistance to, right? There are some things that are truly gnarly that are going to make you sick no matter what. But you can build up some resiliency against some of the lesser evils and the more common gut parasites. So seems that it's working out okay for Juan Pablo, but I really wouldn't recommend it as a good strategy for the general person. And it seems like some of them out there aren't doing that well with it. Personally, I did the same thing as Juan Pablo. I drank the water straight from Cunete, also known as Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. I felt good about that choice, and it felt like it was not just a practical consideration, because like Juan Pablo, I knew how dehydrated I was going to get if I had to carry my pot everywhere with me and haul water up and make a fire every time I wanted to drink something and then wait for it to cool. You know, it's quite a process, and it means you're going to be drinking less water. And dehydration can be a major, major issue. It might be part of what made Igor's heart freak out and what made him leave, right? So it can be really significant. Also part of constipation, and we've seen that with Terry and what a big deal it can be, right? So it's very big. Also, for me, with Cunede, I felt like I am here to trust my life to this place, and drinking its water feels like an act of trust. And so it felt like the trust was reciprocal, trusting it, asking it to trust me and provide for me. It could go either way. It's a gamble. It's a gamble I was willing to take. It's a gamble Juan Pablo seems willing to take. And it illustrates that you never know. You got to do what's right for you, and everybody is different. And then we go to Karrie in her shelter, which looks like it's in a beautiful spot that has a lot of nice open land around it, and she's getting really nice sun. And we see her in that debate that is a constant on Alone. I really want to work on my shelter, but I haven't eaten for a while and I really need food. That is the constant back and forth. They are basically the two most important things when you're out there, because the shelter is your main protection from the weather, which is really important for conserving calories, but then you really want to have calories coming in. So in fact, they're both calorie questions, but yeah, totally get it, Karrie. That was the constant debate with me, and it really depended on what the day was like, which I prioritized. Beautiful day, I'd be out hunting, and then all of a sudden the snow flurry would come, and I'd just be like, oh my God, there's nothing more important than shelter. So totally good illustration of the regular alone dilemma. But Karrie says something interesting out there that really stuck in my head, which is that every animal I get out here is 1, 2, 3 days worth of food. And then later in the same episode, we see the number of calories in both that trout she catches and the rabbit that Tom gets. And it says there, this animal contains around 800, 875 for the hare, 800 for the trout, 800 calories. That is not enough food for 1, 2, or 3 days. The average, the US RDA is 2,500 a day for a man, 2,000 for a woman, and that's totally dependent on your size and your activity level and what you have. But the baseline, 2,000 calories a day. 800 in one trout or rabbit, that's not even a third of what you actually need for a full day's food. But this kind of shows the way when you're going with really, really low calories, that every bit of food feels so much more potent, and it feels like it could keep you for a day or two, because most of the days you don't have anything. So a third of an animal feels like totally a day's worth of food, right? It just kind of illustrates that it's all relative, right? What feels like a day's worth of food when you're totally starving feels really different than what feels like a day's worth of food when you're used to 3 meals a day and plenty of calories. It also shows the degree to which food is so much more about the psychology out there than the calories, because everybody, even the folks doing well, are usually losing weight and going hungrier than they're used to. We see people getting 1 squirrel and 1 trout a day, and it's like, oh my God, you're wealthy. If you look at the calorie equation, it's still like 1,000 calories less than just the baseline. And that doesn't include when you're working hard or when you're in a cold environment. So the daily calorie requirements out there, probably more like 4,000, considering the temperatures and how hard folks are working, or considerably more. It's different for everyone, but you get what I'm saying. Holy cow, you guys, Tom's shelter. Now, obviously some days have elapsed since we saw that little wall, but holy cow, I am so impressed. Also, Tom just confirmed that he's going to be on one of my Patreon calls, hopefully the next one coming up soon. So awesome opportunity. We're going to be talking with Tom and with Timogen. And now that I see what Tom's shelter is turning into, super excited for that call. I am going to say thus far, I'm so impressed with Tom's. I feel like it's perhaps the best shelter we've seen so far on Alone. And why is that? Freaking chimney. That chimney, it's such a great system. So I have to say, I love that Tom is building against that solid wall. A lot of energy to dig out for sure, but that's half of his shelter already done with that big sturdy back wall. And then because he's done that basket style system, it's a little bit like the wattle and daub system that Adam used for his chimney, a little bit like the bamboo shelter that Zach Fowler built on season 3. And the way that he has the basket part built against the wall means that he can just kind of shove things back behind there and get incredible insulation with very little effort. So it's looking awesome. But that chimney is so great because it's really solid and it's built against the wall. So way less energy because he's building it against the solid earth. So again, that's half of the chimney already taken care of, and it doesn't have to be self-supporting. So it's less energy for him and it's really effective. Plus he's building with stone. So unlike Adam's, that's the stick and clay, as I've mentioned, I'm worried about it catching fire, but Tom's a solid stone, which not just makes it fireproof, but it means that's a huge thermal mass that's going to be absorbing the heat and giving it back all of the times that he isn't actively having a fire in there. Well, until the heat is gone. But it's going to be an awesome strategy. And he even has that little shelf on top where he can be keeping his food warm. It is looking so good. Really, really excited to see what you've got going there, Tom. Awesome. Now, we have heard about this before, but I really love Tom talking at length about the ethics of trapping and how vital it is to go and check your trap line a minimum of once a day, that it's not humane to do anything less. And this is so true, and I'm really, really happy to see you talking about it and that they put it in, Tom. The thing is that it's not inhumane to a rabbit that's already dead, like the one in his trap, right? But sometimes the noose is a little too big and rabbits pass through and get caught by the hips instead, or have one leg through, so it doesn't go around their neck, which means they are caught in there alive and struggling and definitely suffering. So that's part of why it's super important that you go and check to make sure that if there is a live rabbit in your trap, one, you can get it out of its misery quicker, and then two, an animal that is caught and suffering and freaking out, that's going to be terrible meat because the stress hormones are going to be flooding its system, and it's going to make it tough and less delicious. The other thing, of course, is that an animal that is struggling in a trap alive is very likely to be bringing in predators. The sound of an animal distress is going to be calling all predators from a long way away. So it's like ringing the dinner bell for the predators in your area. Even if that rabbit is dead in your trap, still, its chances of bringing in a predator, the smell of blood, is going to be high. And then not only have you lost your animal, but you have now taught the predators where to come for their next meal. This happened to me on season 6, where the foxes started showing up and stealing rabbits out of my snares. And it was so frustrating not being able to collect the animals that I knew that I had killed myself. And then to know that all my future trapping efforts might be for naught because I had taught the fox to come and clean them out. So really important to check your snares at least once a day, and sometimes if you can, if you have the calories for it, more than once a day, to make sure you get them out before a predator can find them. Love how appreciative and grateful Tom is. And Tom, we can just feel your excitement and what a big deal it is for you to get that rabbit. Super, super thrilled for you. Love the way you're processing it and that you're using every part. Absolutely, the collagen in those tendons, really important food source. And I typically case skinned all my rabbits, where you just cut between the back legs and peel off the skin, which makes it easier to deal with. I think that it looks like Tom took the back straps off the rabbit, like he put everything else in the stew pot, but took off the back straps to cook separately. And I loved seeing that because that is what I did with all of my rabbits, hares technically, when I was out on season 6. The backstrap is basically the filet mignon. It's the muscles that run right along the spine, thus backstrap. And it's the choicest cut of any animal. And even though I think he's doing it just right to cook everything down in the pot, sometimes the taste of actual like sauteed or roasted meat is just so amazing. And so I think it's a great call to cook those back straps, which are going to be more tender and delicious, separate, and eat everything else stewed. Loved seeing him bite into that back thigh. Really interesting, and we'll see if this is true for him. But what I found long-term, slowly starving to death with no fat in my system, is that I got to where I could really feel the difference in the amount of fat in every different muscle in the animal's body. And interestingly, those back thighs, they are the biggest, meatiest, most delicious part of the animal because they're the biggest straight meat. But they are lower in fat because the thigh muscle and the glute muscle, so the butt, which is basically what you're getting in that thigh, those are really big muscles. And it's the small muscles that are wrapped in connective tissue with a membrane around them. There's fat between most of those muscles. So actually the shoulder, even though it's less big bit of meat, I came to enjoy that much more than the thigh. The thigh got to be where it was so dry, I could feel it sucking the fat from my body, whereas the shoulder had just enough fat that it really felt like nourishing food. So I'm curious if we're going to see anything like that shown as the shift towards true calorie deprivation happens later in the season.